They were seconds away from closing the coffin. The room was prepared for finality. Flowers surrounded the casket. Mourners stood in silence. The priest had already begun the last words that no one ever wants to hear too soon. According to every official record, every medical report, and every authority present, the woman inside that coffin was dead. But she wasn't. No one in the room knew it yet. Not the doctors. Not the family. Not the powerful executives standing with folded hands and empty expressions. They believed the story was over, and that belief made what was about to happen even more terrifying. At the back of the room stood a janitor who could not look away. He had no medical degree, no status, no reason, in their eyes, to question anything. Yet as he watched the woman lying motionless inside the casket, a violent sense of dread settled in his chest. Her stillness felt wrong. Not peaceful, not final. Wrong in a way he could not explain, but could not ignore. He knew what would happen if he spoke up. He would be humiliated, removed, possibly fired. He would be remembered as the man who disrupted a billionaire's funeral for nothing. And yet, if he stayed silent, the consequences would be irreversible. Because if he was right, they were about to bury a living woman. Time moved cruelly fast. Each word of the prayer pushed the moment closer to no return. The lid would close. The coffin would be sealed. And the truth, whatever it was, would be buried with her. What happened next shattered every assumption in that room. This is not a story about heroism as we like to imagine it. It is a story about fear, intuition, and the cost of speaking when no one wants to listen. Stay until the end, because the moment the janitor raised his hand changed lives, careers, and exposed a truth no one was prepared to face. Subscribe now if you believe the most dangerous mistakes happen when we silence doubt. The story you're about to hear proves that sometimes the person everyone ignores is the only one paying attention. It was a cold, gray day when the billionaire's funeral was held. The grandiose ceremony took place in a luxurious chapel, with expensive flowers adorning every corner and mourners dressed in their finest attire. The coffin, sleek and polished, was placed in the center of the room, surrounded by family, friends, and high-profile dignitaries. The whispers of sorrow filled the air, but there was an unmistakable undercurrent of curiosity. Who would be the next in line to inherit the family's wealth? This was not just a funeral. It was a spectacle of status and power. Yet, amidst the crowd of perfectly poised mourners, one figure stood out. A janitor, dressed in the plainest uniform, was quietly working in the background. His hands were steady as he dusted the back corners of the chapel, doing his job without drawing attention. But his heart was racing. He knew something others didn't, something that would change everything. As the ceremony progressed, with people speaking of the deceased woman's incredible achievements and wealth, the janitor was becoming more and more unsettled. He had been cleaning the billionaire's mansion for years, and he knew her better than anyone thought. In fact, he had seen her just days before her supposed passing. She had looked perfectly alive, and he had even had a brief conversation with her. The whispers grew louder as the priest spoke of her life. She had been a businesswoman, a philanthropist, and a mother, but something about her death just didn't sit right with him. How could a woman as vibrant as her simply die, just like that? And why had no one noticed the odd details surrounding her death? The janitor's eyes flicked to the coffin as the priest raised his hands for the final blessing. His gut was screaming at him. He had to do something. He couldn't stay silent any longer. As the mourners prepared to say their final goodbyes, the janitor stepped forward. His voice trembled, but he knew what he had to do. He raised his hand, interrupting the quiet ceremony. "She's not dead," he shouted, his voice filled with a mix of fear and certainty. The room went silent. All eyes turned to him in disbelief. The billionaire's family looked horrified, while the mourners exchanged puzzled glances. No one knew what to make of the janitor's words. But for him, there was no turning back now. The priest froze in place, unsure of how to respond to such an accusation. Was this just the ramblings of a lowly janitor, or was there some truth to his statement? The atmosphere shifted from somber to tense, and all attention was now on the man who had dared to challenge the truth that everyone had accepted. He had interrupted the final rites, and what followed would send shockwaves through the entire room. The silence in the room was deafening. The janitor's outburst had shattered the mournful atmosphere, and no one seemed to know how to react. The mourners stared at him, their faces a mix of confusion and disbelief. The billionaire's family, who had been sitting at the front, were frozen in their seats, clearly uncomfortable with the interruption. The priest, though still holding his hands in the air, seemed at a loss for words. For a moment, it seemed like the world had stopped spinning. The janitor, standing alone in the center of the room, felt the weight of every eye on him. But despite the tension, he couldn't back down. He knew what he had seen, and he wasn't going to let this opportunity slip away. His words echoed in his mind. "She's not dead." He repeated himself, louder this time. "She's not dead." He stepped forward cautiously, the air thick with anticipation. "I saw her just days ago. She was alive, talking, walking. I spoke with her. There's no way she's gone." The room was still, but now the murmurs began to rise. People were starting to wonder if the janitor was delusional or if there might be some truth to his words. The family's reactions were mixed. The billionaire's eldest son, a man known for his cold demeanor and sharp business sense, stood up. He shot a glance toward his mother, who was visibly shaken by the disruption. She quickly composed herself and stood, her voice trembling as she addressed the crowd. "This man is mistaken," she said firmly, trying to maintain control of the situation. "My daughter has passed. There's no mistake." But the janitor wasn't backing down. "No, you're wrong," he said. His voice was calm, but his conviction was unshakable. "I saw her. She looked just like she always did. And I'm telling you, something is wrong with this picture." He didn't know exactly what was going on, but he knew that everything he had learned over the years working in the billionaire's mansion had led him to this moment. As the janitor continued to speak, the people in the room began to look at each other uncertainly. Could he really be telling the truth? Was it possible that the woman they thought had passed was still alive? The more the janitor spoke, the more doubt began to creep into the minds of the mourners. It was clear now that something was amiss, and no one knew what would happen next. The priest, still stunned, lowered his hands and stepped back. He had no idea how to proceed with the ceremony now. Should they continue with the funeral, or should they investigate the janitor's claims? This wasn't just a simple case of mistaken identity. It felt like a scandal waiting to erupt. The janitor's interruption had changed the course of the event, and no one could ignore the implications of what he had just revealed. As the tension in the room mounted, a question lingered in the air. Was this a desperate cry for attention, or had the janitor uncovered something that no one else was willing to see? The tension inside the chapel grew heavier with every passing second. What had once been a controlled, almost rehearsed ceremony now felt fragile, as if a single wrong word could cause it to collapse entirely. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure whether they were witnessing an embarrassing interruption or the beginning of something far more serious. The janitor's words lingered in the air, refusing to disappear, planting seeds of doubt where certainty had once ruled. The doctors present at the funeral exchanged glances filled with irritation and disbelief. They were professionals, trained, respected, and trusted. The idea that a janitor could challenge their conclusion felt insulting. One of them cleared his throat and spoke with authority, explaining that all medical procedures had been followed correctly, that death had been confirmed, and that there was absolutely no room for error. His tone was firm, but beneath it, a subtle discomfort could be sensed. The janitor listened carefully, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. He did not argue with medical terminology or scientific explanations. Instead, he spoke from experience, from observation, from instinct sharpened by years of paying attention to details others ignored. He explained that something about her appearance did not align with death as he had seen it before. Her posture, her color, the stillness that felt too deliberate rather than final. These were not facts found in textbooks, but they were real to him. Murmurs spread across the room as people began whispering to one another. Some dismissed him immediately, labeling him unstable or desperate for attention. Others, however, felt an uncomfortable sensation creeping into their thoughts. What if he was right? What if, in their rush to conclude, something crucial had been overlooked? That possibility, however small, was terrifying. Accepting it meant admitting that a catastrophic mistake could have been made. The family remained divided. Some demanded that security remove the janitor at once, insisting that the ceremony continue without further disruption. Others hesitated, torn between anger and fear. The idea that their loved one might still be alive was too painful to hope for, yet too horrifying to ignore. Their emotions collided violently, creating an atmosphere thick with internal conflict. The priest stood silently to the side, watching the scene unravel. He had officiated countless funerals, but never had he witnessed doubt invade so forcefully at such a critical moment. He understood that funerals were meant to bring closure, not questions. Yet now, closure was slipping away, replaced by an unbearable uncertainty that demanded attention. The janitor took a step closer to the coffin, his voice steady despite the pressure crushing his chest. He said he was willing to accept any consequence, any punishment, if he was wrong. But if there was even the smallest chance that she was still alive, he could not forgive himself for staying silent. His words were not dramatic. They were simple, honest, and devastating in their sincerity. In that moment, the room reached a breaking point. The doubt was no longer his alone. It had spread, quietly and relentlessly, forcing everyone present to confront a truth they had hoped was impossible. Whether they liked it or not, the certainty of death had been shaken, and nothing would ever feel the same again. The decision to pause the funeral did not come easily, but it came inevitably. The doubt planted by the janitor had grown too large to ignore, spreading through the room like an unspoken fear that clung to every breath. The priest finally raised his hand, signaling for silence, and announced that the ceremony would be temporarily halted. That single statement felt heavier than any prayer spoken that day, because it acknowledged what no one wanted to admit. Something might be terribly wrong. Security approached the janitor, not to remove him, but to restrain the situation itself. Their movements were cautious, uncertain, reflecting the confusion gripping everyone present. The family watched closely, torn between outrage and dread. If this interruption proved false, it would be an unforgivable humiliation. If it proved true, it would be a nightmare beyond comprehension. Either way, the moment demanded answers. A senior doctor stepped forward, his expression tense but controlled. He insisted that a brief verification could be performed to put an end to the chaos. His confidence was meant to restore order, yet it carried an undercurrent of defensiveness. He approached the coffin with measured steps, fully aware that dozens of eyes were tracking his every move, waiting for him to confirm what they desperately needed to believe. The lid of the coffin was adjusted slightly, just enough to allow visibility without fully exposing the body. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Death had been discussed, accepted, and ritualized, but now it was being confronted directly. The woman's face appeared peaceful, almost too peaceful, as if frozen between states rather than fully surrendered to one. That subtle ambiguity unsettled those who noticed it. The doctor leaned closer, performing quick, routine checks meant to end the speculation. At first, nothing seemed out of place. The room held its breath. The janitor watched intently, his heart pounding, knowing that this was the point of no return. If he was wrong, his life would change forever. If he was right, so would everyone else's. Seconds passed, stretching into what felt like an eternity. Then, something shifted. Not dramatically, not unmistakably, but just enough to cause hesitation. The doctor paused, his hand hovering slightly longer than necessary. His brow furrowed, and he repeated the check, slower this time, more carefully. The tension in the room sharpened, slicing through every remaining doubt. A murmur rose as the doctor straightened, his face drained of certainty. He did not announce a conclusion immediately. Instead, he requested additional equipment and assistance, a move that sent shockwaves through the attendees. That request alone was enough to confirm what everyone feared. This was no longer a formality. Something unexpected was unfolding. In that frozen moment, reality fractured. The funeral was no longer about saying goodbye. It had transformed into a confrontation with the terrifying possibility that death had been declared too soon. And at the center of it all stood a janitor who had refused to look away when everyone else already had. The room had fallen into an unnatural silence, the kind that feels heavier than noise. Every breath, every subtle movement echoed far louder than it should have. The doctor stood motionless beside the coffin, his professional confidence visibly shaken. What had begun as a gesture meant to dismiss doubt had now opened a door no one wanted to step through. The weight of responsibility settled over him, pressing down harder with each passing second. The janitor watched closely, his entire body tense, but his expression controlled. He was no longer driven by fear of humiliation or punishment. Those emotions had faded, replaced by a singular focus, the truth. He knew that whatever happened next would confirm whether his intuition had been a cruel mistake or a necessary act of courage. Around him, faces reflected the same silent question, though few were brave enough to voice it. The doctor leaned in once more, this time abandoning routine and precision in favor of patience. He placed his fingers carefully where he had been trained to detect the faintest signs of life. Time seemed to slow as everyone waited, unwilling to blink, unwilling to distract themselves from the fragile moment unfolding. The air felt thin, charged with anticipation and fear. At first, there was nothing. The tension tightened. Some attendees shifted uneasily, preparing themselves for disappointment, already forming silent judgments against the janitor. But then, barely perceptible, something changed. A faint movement, a subtle response, so slight it could easily have been dismissed had it not been intentionally sought. The doctor froze, his breath catching involuntarily. He tried again, more carefully, more deliberately. His expression transformed from skepticism to confusion, and then to something far more alarming. His eyes widened slightly, and his posture stiffened as he processed what his training told him was impossible under the circumstances. The room seemed to tilt as reality adjusted to accommodate an unthinkable truth. A low murmur spread like a ripple through the crowd, growing in intensity as the doctor stepped back. He did not speak immediately. He did not need to. His silence, his hesitation, said more than any declaration could have. The certainty of death had cracked, and through that fracture, fear poured freely. Someone demanded an explanation. Another person called for emergency services. Order disintegrated as voices overlapped, and panic surfaced beneath controlled exteriors. The priest stepped aside. The family stood in shock, and security no longer knew whether to intervene or protect. In the center of it all, the coffin ceased to represent an ending and became a symbol of uncertainty. The janitor closed his eyes briefly, not in relief, but in solemn acceptance. He understood the gravity of what had just occurred. If he had remained silent, if he had chosen comfort over conviction, the outcome would have been irreversible. The realization settled heavily within him, knowing that his voice, once ignored, had altered the course of a life. In that moment, the truth could no longer be denied. A sign of life, however fragile, had been found. The funeral was over, not because it had concluded, but because it had never truly belonged there in the first place. The confirmation that there was a sign of life did not bring relief. Instead, it unleashed chaos. The room, moments earlier governed by ritual and restraint, erupted into confusion as people struggled to process what they had just witnessed. Conversations overlapped, voices rose, and carefully maintained composure dissolved under the weight of fear. The idea that a woman declared dead might still be alive was not comforting. It was horrifying. It forced everyone present to confront how close they had come to an irreversible tragedy. Doctors began issuing urgent instructions, their tones sharp and unsteady. Equipment was requested, emergency procedures activated, and assumptions discarded without ceremony. What had once been a closed case was now wide open, exposing the dangerous consequences of haste and certainty. Every professional in the room understood the implications. This was not merely an anomaly. It was a failure that could never be fully erased. Family members reacted in fractured ways. Some broke down in tears, overwhelmed by the shock of hope colliding with terror. Others stood frozen, faces pale, grappling with guilt they had not yet fully named. The realization that they had mourned someone who was not truly gone tore through them mercilessly. Love, fear, relief, and shame blended into something unbearable. The coffin was carefully opened further, no longer treated as a final resting place, but as a medical emergency. The luxury surrounding it suddenly felt obscene, a cruel contrast to the fragile reality unfolding inside. Attendees watched as the body was prepared for immediate transport, each movement deliberate, reverent, and tense. No one dared to look away, yet no one wanted to remember this moment clearly. Amid the escalating urgency, the janitor stood off to the side, once again fading into the background. No one addressed him. No one apologized. Recognition was not yet possible. The shock was too fresh, the consequences too heavy. But inside him, a storm raged. He replayed the decision to speak up again and again, fully aware that silence would have condemned a living person to death. As paramedics arrived and took control, the room surrendered entirely to disorder. The priest stepped aside, prayers unfinished. Security retreated, uncertain of their role. Authorities shifted rapidly, exposing how fragile hierarchy becomes in the face of raw human error. For the first time that day, power no longer mattered. Only time did. Cameras gathered outside, capturing fragments of the unfolding emergency. Rumors spread instantly, stripped of context and swollen by speculation. A funeral interrupted. A billionaire possibly alive. An unthinkable mistake. Yet no headline would mention the man whose voice had forced the truth into the open. He remained unnamed, unseen, overshadowed by the spectacle. As the stretcher was rushed away, an unbearable silence followed. The room stood emptied not only of people, but of certainty. What remained was a shared understanding that everything they believed moments earlier had been wrong, and that knowledge, once awakened, could never be put back to rest. The hours following the disrupted funeral unfolded in a haze of confusion and disbelief. What should have been a day of closure transformed into a waiting period filled with dread, unanswered questions, and quiet panic. Those who had attended the ceremony struggled to return to their lives as if nothing had happened. Every conversation, every news alert, and every silence carried the weight of what might have been the gravest mistake imaginable. At the hospital, medical teams worked relentlessly, attempting to stabilize a situation that never should have existed. Reports were reviewed, timelines reconstructed, and procedures scrutinized with brutal honesty. The unspoken acknowledgement of failure hovered over every corridor. No one needed to say it aloud. The truth was evident in the urgency of their movements and the avoidance in their eyes. The family remained isolated, caught between hope and terror. They waited in sterile rooms, replaying the funeral in their minds, haunted by images of flowers, speeches, and final prayers spoken too soon. The emotional whiplash was unbearable. Mourning had not ended. It had merely transformed into something far more complicated and painful. Outside, the story began to take shape in the public sphere. News outlets raced to report what little they knew, filling gaps with speculation and sensationalism. A billionaire pronounced dead. A funeral interrupted. A shocking medical oversight. Yet amidst the noise, one crucial detail remained largely overlooked. The man whose insistence had prevented an unthinkable outcome. The janitor returned home that night, exhausted in ways sleep could not repair. He sat alone, staring at walls that felt suddenly unfamiliar. The enormity of what had happened settled in slowly, pressing down on him with unexpected force. He wondered whether he would be blamed, dismissed, or forgotten. What he did not question was his decision. Speaking up had been necessary, regardless of the cost. Days passed before confirmation emerged that the woman had survived. Her condition was critical but stable, and the truth could no longer be hidden. The relief was tempered by a chilling realization shared by everyone involved. Survival had not been guaranteed. It had been granted by a margin so thin it bordered on chance. Whispers turned into conversations, and conversations into uncomfortable reflections. People began to question how easily authority silences doubt, how often intuition is dismissed based on status rather than substance. The funeral became a symbol, not of death, but of collective failure and narrowly avoided disaster. In quiet moments, the janitor's name surfaced among those who knew the full story. Not yet celebrated, not yet acknowledged publicly, but remembered. And that quiet recognition marked the beginning of a shift that would soon force the world to reconsider who deserves to be heard. When the woman finally opened her eyes, it did not happen with drama or sudden clarity. It was a slow return, marked by confusion, blurred vision, and the steady rhythm of machines surrounding her. For a moment, she did not understand where she was or why her body felt so heavy. The sterile smell of the hospital replaced the familiar luxury she was accustomed to, and that unfamiliarity unsettled her far more than physical discomfort ever could. Doctors gathered quietly, watching every movement with intense focus. What they were witnessing was not just a recovery, but a confrontation with their own assumptions. The condition that had mimicked death so convincingly was now undeniable proof that certainty can be dangerous when paired with haste. Their relief was real, but it was inseparable from the weight of what nearly happened under their care. As awareness returned, fragments of memory surfaced. The woman remembered feeling weak, disoriented, and unable to communicate properly before everything went dark. She recalled sounds fading, voices becoming distant, and the terrifying sensation of being present but unheard. That memory alone sent a chill through her, even as she lay safely surrounded by medical staff. Her first coherent question stunned everyone in the room. She did not ask about her fortune, her company, or the fallout that surely awaited her. Instead, in a quiet but steady voice, she asked who had stopped the funeral. The room fell silent. Eyes shifted uncomfortably. No one rushed to answer, because the truth carried an embarrassment that no explanation could soften. Eventually, someone mentioned the janitor. Not a doctor, not a specialist, a man whose name few remembered, whose role had been deemed insignificant. The woman listened intently, her expression tightening not with anger, but with disbelief. The idea that someone so easily dismissed had been the only one willing to question her death unsettled her deeply. When she asked to meet him, hesitation followed. Some feared the encounter would reopen wounds or invite scrutiny. Others worried about what she might say once confronted with the reality of how close she came to being buried alive. But her request was firm, and it carried a gravity no one dared to challenge. The janitor entered the room quietly, unsure of what awaited him. He stood awkwardly at first, overwhelmed by the contrast between her vulnerability and the power she once embodied so effortlessly. She studied him in silence, not as a superior, but as someone searching for understanding. In that moment, status dissolved completely. What emerged between them was not a dramatic exchange, but a shared realization. Years earlier, she had unknowingly intervened to save his job during a corporate restructuring. A small decision to her, barely remembered. To him, it had been life-changing. Now, the balance had shifted. The smallest act of awareness had returned to her multiplied beyond measure, closing a circle neither of them had ever seen forming. The meeting between the janitor and the woman did not explode into headlines immediately. Instead, it unfolded quietly, away from cameras and corporate statements. What passed between them in that hospital room was not about gratitude alone, but about recognition. For the first time, she truly saw someone whose presence had always existed in the background of her world, unnoticed yet essential. That realization unsettled her more than the near-death experience itself. As she recovered, fragments of the story began to surface beyond the hospital walls. Whispers turned into confirmed reports, and confirmed reports evolved into a narrative that captured public attention. A funeral stopped. A billionaire alive. A mistake narrowly avoided. The contrast between wealth and invisibility fascinated audiences, forcing them to confront uncomfortable questions about who is believed and who is ignored. Pressure mounted on institutions involved. Medical boards initiated investigations, protocols were reviewed, and statements were issued that attempted to balance accountability with damage control. Yet none of those efforts erased the central truth. Without one man's refusal to remain silent, the outcome would have been irreversible. That truth lingered stubbornly, immune to spin or distraction. The woman chose to speak publicly once she regained strength. When she did, her words were measured and deliberate. She refused to frame her survival as a miracle or an act of fate. Instead, she spoke about human error, misplaced confidence, and the danger of dismissing voices based on status. When she named the janitor, she did so without embellishment, allowing the simplicity of the fact to carry its full weight. Public reaction was immediate and intense. Stories poured in from people who had been ignored, overruled, or silenced in moments that mattered. The janitor's actions became a symbol not of heroism in the traditional sense, but of moral clarity. He had not sought attention. He had sought truth, and that distinction resonated deeply. For the janitor, the sudden attention was uncomfortable. He had spent a lifetime blending into walls and corridors, finding dignity in work that rarely earned acknowledgement. Now, strangers spoke his name with admiration. Yet he remained grounded, aware that the decision he made had never been about recognition. It had been about refusing to walk away when something felt profoundly wrong. In boardrooms and hospitals alike, quiet changes began to take shape. New protocols emphasized listening, verification, and humility. Training sessions referenced the incident not as a scandal, but as a lesson. Slowly, painfully, systems adjusted, reminded that certainty without scrutiny can be lethal. In the end, the greatest revelation was not that a woman survived her own funeral, but that truth often arrives from places power refuses to look. And once uncovered, it demands to be acknowledged, no matter how inconvenient or uncomfortable it may be. Time moved forward, but nothing returned to the way it had been before that day. The woman resumed her life with a clarity she had never possessed, forever aware that she had stood at the edge of an ending that never should have happened. Her power, once exercised with unquestioned certainty, now carried restraint and reflection. Survival had not only saved her life, it had stripped away the illusion of infallibility she once believed protected her. The janitor returned to his routines, to hallways and tasks few noticed, yet something within him had shifted permanently. He no longer measured his worth by how often he was acknowledged, but by the knowledge that his conscience had guided him when it mattered most. His story was not one of sudden transformation, but of quiet consistency, proving that courage does not announce itself before acting. The interrupted funeral became a reference point, not as a scandal to be forgotten, but as a reminder of what happens when systems value hierarchy over humanity. It exposed the danger of equating authority with truth and demonstrated how easily irreversible decisions can be made when doubt is dismissed. For many, it became an uncomfortable lesson that could no longer be ignored. What endured most powerfully was not the near tragedy, but the question it left behind. How many times are warnings overlooked simply because they come from the wrong voice, the wrong uniform, or the wrong position? How often does silence feel safer than speaking, even when something feels undeniably wrong? These questions lingered long after headlines faded. This story is not about wealth, status, or miracles. It is about attention, responsibility, and the quiet strength required to stand alone when certainty feels false. It reminds us that integrity often appears in ordinary moments, carried by people the world has trained itself not to see. If this story made you pause, reflect, or reconsider the way you listen to others, this channel is for you. Here, we share powerful human stories that reveal hidden truths, challenge assumptions, and remind us that even one voice can change a destiny. Subscribe now and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that deserves to be heard until the very end.